Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Rewarded, written by Drach Graith. You will receive generous compensation, it said, its keening hiss translated automatically by the oral implant of Godrak's ear, somehow managing to convey even the oily slickness of his jailer's words. He had failed to reply. It slithered closer, continuing to squeal at him as one of its upper graspers pressed the little metallic rod to his upper chest. Immediately, pain radiated from the point of contact, every nerve simultaneously telling his brain that he was being crushed, burned, and shocked, seemingly in an unending wave of sensation. Godrak reacted against every desire in his body by screaming, though his voice now was too hoarse and his throat too raw for the sound to carry anything more than a bestial sense of anguish. After several seconds, the strange creature removed the device. Immediately, the pain ceased, and Godrak fell back to the wall where he was suspended, limp, but once again silent. Pulling back, the creature slithered to his other side, where there was fewer reddened welts, and rephrased the same promise it had made over the last several hours. You above all can be rewarded. Passively exhausted, Godrak replied only by dropping his shoulders. The Titania, a race of 2 to 3 meter tall creatures, commonly known to humankind as the Cephis, for their lower half's similarity to cephalopods from their homeworld Earth, were collected en masse above a small green planet. This planet, boasting a mere 0.3 G on a planet 90% the size of Earth, was nestled a mere 171 light-years from Chief Rescue Officer Tyson Godrak's home system. The planet was known to most as the known galaxy as Pecot 1. It was unimaginatively named this due to its importance to the first and original planet from which the Pecot species had come, and it was the Pecot people that had, unintentionally, brought the Titania to their home, all due to an unfortunate diplomatic misstep that ended with the Titania chief diplomat being mocked and derided by the Senate. That exact incident was not known to Godrak or his crew, only that it had occurred. They knew, too, that the Titania had responded to the minor cultural embarrassment by annihilating the Pecot ambassador's ship minutes after it fled from the Senate Central Station, an action that the Pecot people had responded to by tracking down and killing the offending diplomat and the gunnery officer who had actually pulled the trigger. It had been, in the Pecoc's estimation, a merciful response, killing only the 2 responsible for the death of a diplomatic vessel with over 400 crew. Thinking that they had avenged their lost brethren without going so far as to start a war, the replacement Pecot diplomat team had been sent to the Senate to answer for their actions and to, also was claimed by the Pecot, actually apologize for their unintended embarrassment of the Titania people. They had been murdered by the Titania squadron, a mere light second away from the official neutral territory surrounding the Senate Central Station, never to arrive. Exactly what they had intended to say was never known, and the only response the Pecot people took was to contact the Senate and demand official reprimand and guaranteed safe passage for future envoys through non-neutral space. The only response to this action was by the Titania was to declare a holy war and pledge to exterminate all of the Pecot species. The Senate, characteristically, was still having a spirited debate about whether or not this was a reasonable action, and would likely continue the debate until one side or the other emerged victorious, declaring unanimously that they had long supported the victims' claims and then fining them a pittance for the appearance of justice. This, too, was why Chief Rescue Officer Godrak was now enduring an unspeakable and blatantly illegal torture of the Titania Chief Admiral, or at least in a roundabout fashion. The explicit reason he was being tortured was a bit more complicated. When the FTL communication systems picked up information sent towards the United Terran Systems from the Galactic Senate Central Station, it carried news that was approximately 81 hours old, at a distance of 3,800 light-years. However, this was generally deemed a reasonable and frankly relatively miraculous achievement. It did, however, mean that humanity received word of the Titania fleet rushing into Pecot system space slightly over 3 days after it had happened. And 21 hours later, when the first report reached the United Terran Systems and their governments learned that the Titania had simply been completely eradicating planets in their attack on the Pequot, it meant that they were 4 days late to respond. Academic experts began doing some rather horrific calculations and announced that if the Titania continued their current pace, it would lead to the complete eradication of the 29.3 billion Pequot lives still on their system planet in slightly under 2 weeks. The humans responded. They launched a project that they had been working on for roughly 2.5 human lifetimes, which by now were roughly averaging 140 years. 340 years of work had gone into the invention and required the effective economic backing of a dozen planetary colonies. It had been successfully tested in Terran systems, but had never been subjected to the punishment of the Titania military would soon subject it to. Deployed 81.5 hours after the Terrans were made aware of the Titania had moved from fighting the Pequot military to the wholesale slaughter of civilians, the Terran Senate had voted on its use unanimously after a hastily convened emergency session that lasted a record-breaking mere 4 minutes. And it had launched from its home in orbit towards Pequot's system only 18 minutes later. That was why Chief Rescue Officer Gordek was here. In reality, he had been on call, one of the many humans stationed in the spaceport where the secret was kept, and as head of the Terran rescue team, he had been the one to key in the code to start the operation. After re-entry into the space in Pequot's system, each of the 5 copies of the secret was deployed at his command, creating a one-of-a-kind shield surrounding not only each of the remaining 5 Pequot planets, but several thousand miles above the surface in a protective sphere. The AI running each device was more complex than anything humanity had ever created before now, and intended as a last resort in the event of invasion against their own planets. But here it was, deployed for the first time against the true enemy forces. It had little effect on craft that it deemed friendly or neutral, while entirely preventing objects moving beyond a given speed, or with specific energy signatures, from entering the space. The Titania ships, which had not yet arrived from their most recent resupply after eliminating the 6th remaining Pequot planet, had arrived to find that despite their very best efforts, they could not harm the Pequot people or their home. As one human assistant rescue officer remarked, "We had to put the pissy little squids in a timeout." The intention had been, at least as far as they had planned it, for the humans to wait for additional human reinforcements, a genuine military presence to deploy when they were able, while leaving behind a sizable fleet in their home systems in case the Titania took umbrage with their decision to intercede. For the first brief time, this had been successful, until the Titania had managed to capture the deployment ship of Pequot 1's sphere of safety through subterfuge and a promise to the human leader that they would not break galactic law and hold prisoner any ship that came to communicate under the flag of parley. This all explained then why Chief Gordek was one of only 3 of this crew left alive, and why he was receiving the direct attention of Titania Chief Admiral and his disturbingly impressive collection of torture devices. "Give in now," shrieked the Chief Admiral in Gordek's face, pressing yet a new device up against his skin. It was a much cruder device than the nerve conduction torture device he had been subjected to this morning. He had expected that was because he had simply begun to lose consciousness whenever he had been applied. This new device, much like the old Earth's electric cigarette lighter, was simply causing him burns by sending electricity through a tightly wound coil, which, on the underside of the pad, the SciFi was applying to various areas of flesh. It was not so hot as to destroy the skin and risk genuinely killing him, but the pain was excruciating, and Chief Gordek's reserves of willpower were long since gone. It was no longer determination that kept him going, but the uniquely human desire to do the exact opposite of whatever one is being forced to do, out of a combination of anger, stubbornness, and strange sort of childish delight at proving you cannot be forced to do the damnable thing if you don't want to. With another press of the pad against his lower navel, close to his reproductive organs, Gordek let out an exhausted sort of huff. If he had been stronger, or his vocal cords not horrifically mangled by his earlier screams, he would make a great deal of sound. But, as it was, he was only able to make a strange huffing noise. He also thanked whatever Tedenia god there was that the Tedenians had avoided hurting any of his extremities, including his, manhood, as they had assumed the human would be less sensitive to extremities as they were in his tentacled legs and grasping arms. Being entirely honest with himself, he'd rather doubted that he'd have held out if they knew about the human biology to have tortured him in his most sensitive areas. Still, he knew that he was near breaking now. He would probably lose consciousness again, and he hoped that the Admiral might leave him to unconscious oblivion a while to retrieve some other form of torture, letting the minutes tick by as if in not sleep, at least non-awareness. Each minute that passed, each minute he refused to give in, was repaid many millionfold, for each minute lived by the beings on that planet far below. When he thought of that, his anguished huff almost turned into a laugh, though the incredible bargain he was getting felt less appealing as he saw the Admiral reheating the burning pad in its graspers. For what seemed like the 10,000th time, the revolting creature made its offer.
All you must do is remove it, and you will be rewarded. No, even tell me how to remove it, and you shall be rewarded. I know you must want to. I can see it in you, human. I may not be an expert in xenobiology, but I can see you're losing consciousness. You see, you slipping. This can all end, and your people will be rewarded by the great Tedenian people. All at a single word.
Gordrick tried to tune out the foul promises, instead idly wondering whether he would even be capable of speaking any longer, even if he were to give his assent. His sleepy mind and sluggish thoughts then wandered to another repetitive consideration. How long would it be before the military was deployed out there? Another day? Another week? Surely not 2 weeks. He couldn't tell the time on this miserable crap-hole of a ship, but he was fairly certain he'd been tortured for at least a few days by now. Or, it certainly felt like that long. Another offer came, as expected, followed by another burn. And so it continued, with Gordrick becoming more and more aware that he was no longer even flinching in response to the pain. His muscles too sore and his body too void of energy to do more than slightly shift with each new assault. And dozens more times, dozens upon dozens more times, he was asked, as simply didn't answer when the Admiral asked him,
Don't you want a reward? Do you want this to stop, and for you and your people to be rewarded?
Then, as the next burn landed on his upper thigh, leaving a reddish welt with just barely cooler than the point of blisters forming, he realized that he was no longer entirely certain whether he was going to give in. Now, he was here for an alien, not a person, aliens. Then he considered the likelihood that explaining how to remove the sphere would give a result in him leaving the ship alive, before coming to a frightening and rather distant conclusion that he didn't much care about leaving the ship, so long as his suffering came to an end. It was, as he thought, the terrible thought came to the terrible realization that a screeching squeal further off the ship diverted the Admiral's attention. It was too indistinct and too far off for his oral system to translate the call for him, but whatever was said, it led his torturer away, saying nothing to his prisoner. The sappy bastard slithered his stinking body out of sight. Chief Gordrick blessedly lapsed into unconsciousness in his relief. When Gordrick woke, he was no longer in agony. He was in some sort of medical bay. His clothing had been replaced, and though he was still strapped down, he was in a prone and more comfortable position. The Cephis were nowhere to be seen, and so he started to struggle. His mind didn't seem to be working terribly well, yet, and he had no idea what they had done to remove the burns from his skin, but he was no longer in any sort of discomfort, aside from the strange sort of distance he felt in his head, like he was longer quite the same person, quite attached to the same mind and body. It was, he would have realized if his mind more responsive, a sort of dissociative shock. When he was unable to remove himself from the strange, strap-covered table, he decided that it was perhaps a good idea to go back to sleep. And it took him almost a disturbingly short time for him to lapse back into unconsciousness. He was awoken to the sight of a view screen suspended at arm's length from his face. On that screen was an image of what must have been at least 100 human children pushed together in a slate-grey room somewhere. He did not recognize any of the children, and the view screen gave no sound, but it was obvious somehow that the squiddy bastards had managed, somewhere, to get their hands on a handful of his own species. Of course, they'd used children, to boot, as the human defensiveness of children was a trait known throughout the galaxy. Though most species shared it, it seemed humans were particularly vehement in their defense of children, and so it did not surprise him, however much as it pained him, to wake to the sight in front of his eyes. The thrice-damned octopus-legged arsehole spoke.
Human children, my friend, human children. We have found them, found on wild colonies, our worlds. We have gathered them here to convince you. Do you see them?
The screeching sound was still audible despite the oral translation, and Godric found himself particularly irritated at the sound, far more than he had been at any point during the actual torture. The squid slid his grasper towards the screen, gesturing pointedly at the image as it continued.
Not many humans on our worlds, but we found them for you. You do not like rewards, we take it, but we know your people are very protective of your young ones.
The translator made it sound like a human smiling as he spoke, translating the obliviously self-satisfied tone that he was using.
So we ask you now, do you want your reward? And we will give you the children, your own species' children.
The extended grasper tapped the screen.
We have broadcast this to your people, human. If you choose wrong, your whole species will know what you have chosen, what you have done to these young ones, these children.
Then the Sephi stood up, and the translator made it abundantly obvious that the sick monster believed that it had finally found victory. As the strangely nasal translated voice seemed as if to snicker as he asked them,
Do you want your reward now? Money for you, saving the children, all for a species that have done nothing to justify your protection,
Godric thought, in that moment, that he would rather be tortured again, for eternity, than make the decision he felt too confident was the right one. In that moment, here on the ship, he had been willing to trade every minute of his pain for those millions of minutes lived on the planet below. But to sacrifice those innocents, to lose out on the whole lives that they could lead, their futures, their potential. He had no right, and he had no desire to send them to the graves, but he couldn't stop himself from doing what he knew, in the broken pieces of his shattered heart, was the right thing. He croaked out a terrible sound, his voice unable to make anything more than the tiniest whisper. Still, he said, "No." He cursed at the creature above him, tears spilling from his eyes despite believing he had wept every tear that he had left during this ordeal. He repeated himself louder, "No, you bastard." He forced himself to stare then at the view screen as it silently showed the Tadium guards of the human level their weapons and fire. He forced himself to stare as pools of blood spread out from around the bodies, and a few of the children attempted to flee the room. He forced himself to stare at the screen, blurred through his pouring tears, while the horror played out in front of him to see. The Tedenia Admiral leaning close, a gesture so disturbingly human that it now made Godric want to vomit. It whispered to him,
Your people will see this, human. They will see what you have forced us to do, and you will pay dearly for it.
He paused.
You should have taken our reward when you had the opportunity.
Chief Rescue Officer, in reaction, started to laugh. It was a violent sound, a wheezing sound deep in his chest that was bruised and tired and aching, that had been filled with blood and drained and filled again, only to produce the horrible sound it now projected into the little room where he lay trapped. Then he turned to face the Tedenia and spoke his croaking, broken voice, laughing as he attempted to shout back, You have sent that to my people, to the humans! He coughed and then resumed laughing as he wheezed and shouted, I can't wait to see your kind rewarded. And history tells us that his hateful laugh was the last sound on the recording transmitted to the Terran people that spurred the creation of the Human-Pequot Alliance, an event that today is remembered as the beginning of the Tedania mass extinction. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barkey, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakal, and Arcadian.